Welcome to sectioning once again. And when we're talking about sectioning, in this particular part of series of the classes are going to be demonstrations of like literal, so you can have a mindset to see the practicality of sectioning from what I've done on the mannequin and the human experience. And then now for the people who are have to read, this is all for you. And then also we're going to go through things that are very important in sectioning that might not be able to be explained while I'm working. So the first thing that is very important is loc part ratio. And so loc part ratio means just that. So if my loc is this size versus my loc being, let me find a bigger one, this size, which is bigger, what part do I need to section on the head to get the loc that I want? What ratio will I be using? Now, that ratio is not possible to have a metrics or mathematics to say 1 ounce or 1 inch will give you half a centimeter of loc, because of the very many variables that are in play when doing locs: density, volume, structure, thickness, hair texture, all that, size of the head. So we're going to talk about that. So loc part ratio is very important, and we use something that I call the SALT principle, which you will hear me repeat all the time in most of my classes. The SALT principle basically is not really existing, something that I came up with. Is basically, if you're cooking food for 10 people, how much salt do you need to sprinkle? What about if you're cooking for 30 people? Do you measure 2 ounces of salt for 10 and 20 ounces of salt? No, you just, from experience, you learn how to measure it as you go. And so that's how you learn the loc part ratio as you experience sectioning. However, your first section on the head, if this is the head, this is the back of the head, okay, these are the ears, this is where the line starts. These locs at the end are the ones that you use to know the loc part ratio. So if I wanted this, I'm gonna section that, and I've explained in the coil class, if I'm doing instant loc, I'm gonna instant loc this one with the method that I show you on the instant loc. I'm going to do it with the number 1 to barely be able to have a peripheral view of how the rest would look. And remember, I'm using the SALT principle, which means less is always more. It's better if you do it small than you do it bigger, because you can always add, but you can't subtract. Like salt, you can always add more salt food, but you can't take salt out of food. Even if you add water, once you have more salt on food, the food is done. So if you section and you want to start removing hair, it's a lot of work as opposed to doing a small section and adding hair onto it. So this is what we mean by the loc part ratio. It's one of the most important, it is the most important thing when you're doing sectioning, because if your locs and parts don't have the same ratio, your locs won't have the same size. Now remember, the ratio changes because this part of the head is divided into 3, let's say until there. So there's this top, there's this side from here, from this corner to here, all the way to the back, and then from this part of the ear, here, this is one section, which we're gonna talk about in a while. These 3 sections. So the sections here might have bigger sections than here, because hair is more denser here than here. And because of the shape of the top of the head that curves this way, the sections also will be the same. So you can't have 1 inch versus 1 inch, for example, when you're trying to do locs. That's not how locs work, because also the shape of each and every individual we meet will be a little bit off. Somebody's exactly like I've drawn here, so somebody has a bigger size on this side of the head. What are you supposed to do? You can't force the loc part ratio to be in a matrix form. You have to evolve with every client, and you have to adapt You have to be fluid like water and fit into the space of the person that you're using or person that you're employing the technique to, and that is lock part ratio. I hope it makes sense. You will hear a lot of people talk about lock part ratio. Lock part ratio means the size of part, which is the ratio. Ratio means size. The size of part that makes up the lock. This lock part ratio, the size of part that makes up the lock. That's the definition of lock part ratio. The size of parting that makes up the lock. The size of, and the part is determined by the size of lock they want, the texture of the hair, the density, the place on the head where you are on, because the size here will be different from the size in the middle, which means the lock part ratio here will differ from the lock part ratio here and from here in the same person's head and from one person to another. So this is a term that you want to use as a professional. Lock part ratio. Abuse it, which means use it as much as possible, but not irrelevantly. You know, you will hear a lot of people say lock part ratio, my lock part ratio. Like, for example, I have skinny ones, look at that. And I have a thick one. So technically, my lock part ratio is different from one lock to another. And it used to be different. You get that? So why did I do this? Because this is what I wanted. Okay, remember, always sectioning is about what the client wants, not about you. It's what I wanted. I want to have different locks. I want to have locks that have different shapes. I have different thicknesses. I want to just have a diversity on my head. Okay, so now let's move to something that is very important on number 2.